Chinese are projecting its own agenda, following its own national interest. And then we'll even argue that, hey, we're playing the role of a great power according to our own definition. So thank you very much. We don't need Western imposition of what we should be. We are what we are.
My name is Dawn Murphy, and I'm an associate professor of national security strategy at the U.S. National War College. On behalf of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, I'm pleased to speak today with Yun Sun, a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the China Program at the Stimson Center, and Isaac Kardon, senior fellow for China Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And today we're talking about the situation in the Red Sea. So to provide a bit of context for viewers, the Houthis are an armed opposition group in Yemen. They are funded, trained, and armed by Iran. However, Iran maintains that it does not directly control the Houthi. After October 7th, the Houthis initially targeted Israeli ships, as well as any ships destined for Israel, in a demonstration of support for Hamas as well as the Palestinians. The Houthi claimed their operations would cease once food and medicine reaches all of Gaza. Houthi militants have also fired on merchant vessels of various countries in the Red Sea off the coast of Yemen, in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, a choke point for the global economy. As a result, hundreds of cargo ships and tankers continue to be rerouted around the southern tip of Africa to avoid attacks in the Red Sea. The United States has struck Houthis multiple times since launching its first series of strikes alongside the British military on January 11th, earlier this year. As a result of the risks from Houthi actions, China's state-owned shipping giant, COSCO, has suspended shipping to Israel. China has not, at this point, joined US-led efforts to safeguard commercial passage through the Gulf of Aden, the Red Sea, and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. However, it has been reported in the media that Beijing has pressured Iran to rein in the Houthi attacks. There's also speculation that the Houthis are not targeting Chinese and Russian-flagged vessels. So with this context, we're going to have a very targeted discussion today about the Houthis' behavior and China's response with these two just absolutely amazing specialists that both have written on this issue recently. So I'm going to start with questions. So first, for Yun, how does China's historical stance of non-intervention and its current global interests play into its response in recent Houthi actions in the Red Sea?
Thank you, Dawn. Thanks to the National Committee for the invitation to be here. That's a great question, Dawn. I think first off, we have to define what China's current global interests are, right? And it's definitely not monolithic. And from a Western point of view, we would certainly argue that the peace and stability of the Red Sea represents a core critical national interest of everybody, and not only China. But I think for China, the calculus is slightly different. There's a calculus about economic interest, whether China's energy, transportation, and energy security on MENA, on Middle East and North Africa, has been disrupted by the Red Sea crisis. And then I think there's a question as for how much interest and what approach China will take in terms of addressing that Houthi crisis in the Red Sea. We all know that China have made the argument that eventually the Red Sea crisis traces back to the Israel-Palestine issue, as the Houthis are launching these attacks in support of the Palestinian people in the region. So I think the Chinese will point out that if you want to solve the crisis, let's go back to the two-state solution. And we all know that's an extremely long shot or a long way to address any of the recent or the current crisis. So there are these different layers and different articulations of different global interests that China has. And in terms of the non-interventionism, it is a principle for Chinese foreign policy. I think in this case, if my information is correct, the Chinese has conveyed the message to Iran that they do not wish to see the escalation of tension in the region in order to exert pressure on the Houthis. But I think there is basically we're looking at two layers of trickle down effect, right? First, China's influence on Iran is not absolute. And two, Iran's influence over the Houthis is also not absolute. So I think that's a pretty weak way if China was indeed intending to intervene in the crisis. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. And so this next question I'm going to pose both to Yun and Isaac. So does China's economic reliance on Middle East, specifically for oil, influence its current approach to the Red Sea? Although China may benefit from current U.S. entanglement in the region and negative perceptions of the U.S. in the current Israel-Hamas war, doesn't a prolonged shipping crisis in a vital corridor like the Red Sea also undermine China's economic interests and potentially force its hand in some way?
Well, thanks, Don, and hi to Yun. It's really a pleasure to join both of you, quite sophisticated analysts on the region in particular, and I will defer to each of you on those areas of specialization. But on this particular question about the shipping crisis, a colleague, Jennifer Kavanaugh, and I at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have been thinking a lot about how to put this short-term seeming win for China, as you've articulated, and that they are able to sustain some level of commercial flows there, aren't investing a great deal in it, and kind of benefiting from the negative perceptions of ineffective U.S. responses to this. And also trying to kind of focus our attention on this longer range consideration for China. As the world's largest trading nation, as the world's largest maritime power, as they would call it, but kind of this comprehensive across the board industrial capacity, whether it's in shipbuilding or in shipping or in containers or in cranes, as we're hearing a lot about in the United States lately, that ultimately it's China who disproportionately stands to be harmed from even marginal slowdowns in global trade. And of course, you know, there's no way to make these projections with any sense of certitude for China, but you can certainly look at their vital commodities at sea that are already being subjected to some sort of slowdowns in the form of not actually transiting through the Bab el-Mandeb by and large. You've seen that COSCO, China's biggest shipper, no longer is shipping there. They're sort of ignoring even their own quite costly economic assets in Saudi Arabia in the Red Sea, or in Haifa in Israel, or in Ashdod, where they would otherwise be doing a brisk business. And so over time, what you'd see is China's relying on some 50% of its imported energy supplies from the region. It is deeply reliant on mineral exports, commodities coming from East Africa, and on markets in Europe. And because of its status as the world's largest trading power, because of its sort of disproportionate dependence on these sea lanes, ultimately it's not in its interest for there to be major stoppages in the free flow of maritime commerce. And we can talk about some of the implications in particular, but I'm keen to hear how Yun puts it.
Thank you, Isaac. I absolutely agree with you. I think this, in the long run, is not in China's economic interest if this crisis continues to persist in the future. Currently, when I look at China's calculus regarding its economic reliance on the region, I see some variation from how we perceive the crisis, right? So when the Chinese look at the Red Sea, that yes, 53% of China's oil import comes from the Middle East, and I think the critical transportation routes that China pays attention to there is in terms of the Strait of Hormuz. And when you look at the Red Sea, that is more China's transportation corridor of export to Europe. Mm-hmm. So one could argue that China's oil import has not been significantly impacted by the Red Sea crisis, although its export to Europe has been significantly impacted. Like, according to one Chinese economic calculus, for the Chinese shipment to Europe to avoid the Red Sea region and go down south and go around the Cape of Good Hope, it would indicate a 29% of increase in terms of the transportation cost, plus $4 per ton. And that's like the extra. So I think for the Chinese, when they look at the crisis, that is there an economic impact? Yes, there is economic impact. Is the economic impact so critical and prohibitive that China has to take decisive actions to completely dive into how to tone down or to end this crisis? I don't think China is there yet, which is why I have argued that if the crisis continues to expand, not only escalate in terms of intensity, but also expand geographically to actually have an impact over the Strait of Hormuz and China's actual oil transportation corridor, then we're going to see more actions and more anxiety from China in terms of the crisis. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's, if I could just chime in there, I think that's spot on. And the idea that it's that export channel coming up through the Red Sea and into the Med, where all the big European markets are, is 100% right. And I think the issue there is that the system gets less and less robust as you have more ways that it's disrupted. And I think, you know, it's an unfortunate reality that Iran has periodically challenged free navigation, including commercial navigation through the Straits of Hormuz. And you have to worry, and I know we're going to get into what's the effectiveness of the campaign against it, is what we're seeing here, as well as arguably in East Asia or in the Black Sea or Baltic, is a relatively low level of effectiveness from the U.S. and partners in keeping these sea lanes open. And the question is, what happens to the system in light of continued disintegration or sort of corrosion around the edges of some of these key choke points? And if I'm watching the Houthis and I'm an irregular armed group with a political agenda, I might say, you know, I can achieve a lot of sea power and really stick it to the Americans and, you know, cause a major global economic disruption, or maybe a manageable economic disruption for now, but kind of tack on to this existing phenomenon. I think that would be the worrisome part for me in Beijing, saying, can we trust that the Iranians are going to keep other proxies from causing this type of disruption, say in the Straits of Hormuz, where it would be really quite painful. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, rather.
Great. And actually, this leads well into the next question. And Yun already said a bit about this earlier, but if there's anything else you guys want to add on how much persuasion power do you think China actually has in dealing with Iran in this particular case on the Red Sea, or the Houthis, or both? And I assume Yun is a little skeptical given some of her comments earlier, and I'd love to hear her articulate further, but this is for both of you.
Yeah, I think this type of influence is what we see, that yes, influence, but second removed, right? There are at least two layers of trickling down effect. But I also think that it's a curious question as for how much China can force Iran and Iran can force Houthi to take actions that they perceive to be against their national interests, right? So when we look at patron-client relations, not saying that this is a patron-client relations, but if you look at the relations, patron-client relations, the client usually will do what they perceive to be in their national interest. So it's about persuasion, right? And then it gets into the question that if Iran does believe that the Red Sea crisis is in its interest, what will China have to do to dissuade Iran from having that view? So I think that's where things get really tricky. One argument that's very popular in China is that the marginal cost that China has to pay for that persuasion has been increasing, but the marginal benefit or the marginal effectiveness of that campaign has been decreasing between China and Iran. And I think that's a very interesting perspective into how China can or could influence Iran's decision making.
And Isaac, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Yun knows this bilateral relationship far better than I, so we'll defer on that. But I think the logic of her initial statement, as well as this, really resonates, which is you're going through two layers of purported influence in order to achieve this, and at each of those you have to sort of accept that they're going to be widely divergent interests and levels of, you know, capacity of actually exerting influence. And so I while I do agree that I think it is not as though China can wave a wand with Iran and that's going to stop the Houthi action in its track. I think the question is, who does have some level of influence with Iran, and on the basis purely of its economic dependence on China for its survival over these many years of sanctions and essentially exclusion from the globalized international economic order, by inference, China can call in a lot of shots on potential on foregone trade and investment, slowing things down on this or that front. The development of the gas resources of Iran is something that really depends quite heavily on China. And so they do have them over a barrel in that sense. But as many have been, I think, appropriately willing to ask, what exactly is China's interest in harming its relationship with Iran if it's not yet feeling a major economic consequence from the shutdowns? And I guess back to the original point I made, I think it has to do with the disruption of an open globalized system in which trade flows to between the purchasers and the suppliers without any intermediary of a sphere of influence or a closed block or anything like that. If that's the sort of system that China wants to sustain, it may suit Iran to have a system like that. It may suit Russia to have a system like that, a more of a closed block system. But to my mind, an open economic order is in China's fundamental interest. Their entire economic model hinges on it. And so I would expect that using some of that economic leverage, even if they don't necessarily share the same political objectives as the Iranians, is probably what we might ask of China. And I know we'll get into what their naval assets and laydown look like in the region too, but I will stick with that statement. I think their potential influence on Iran is the most potent tool that they might use.
So shifting gears a little bit on this next question, but since 2008, the U.S. and China and a number of other countries have cooperated in anti-piracy exercises, off the Gulf of Aden in attempting to deal with Somali piracy. What's different about the Red Sea right now? Why has cooperation not materialized? And this, we can start with Isaac and move to Yun.
Sure. Well, if we're talking specifically about why China has not been willing to cooperate, I think, both of you laid this out quite elegantly in the beginning about the political circumstances in play. In the prior case, where it was Somali piracy, totally indiscriminately threatening all shipping, including Chinese, and when there was a UN resolution about countering it in a big multilateral coalition that had been in place for a long time, it was an easy choice for China to take some very modest steps towards cooperation with that. Kind of operating in parallel is all they ever really did in the case of these escort task forces out in the Gulf of Aden. What we see now is that China's shipping is purportedly excluded from this interdiction campaign by the Houthis. They've been doing all sorts of stunts. We saw one of the first things they did was this televised, or rather video recorded, helicopter landing by commandos seizing a vessel that notionally had an Israeli nexus, and they're still holding that vessel and crew. That's not something that the PLA is trained to deal with. This was a really high kind of high intensity stunt, not the kind of garden variety piracy, small boats and sort of lightly armed irregular forces that they'd been used to. And basically what they're seeing is that there isn't a broad international coalition forming up with a coherent concept of operations to actually, secure shipping or to degrade Houthi capability or some combination of those two things. And so it's much easier for them to watch that the US-led coalition, such as it is, faltered, because they're not necessarily paying very high costs in the short term. There are, of course, PLA vessels and a PLA base at Djibouti right there, right on the entrance to the Bab el-Mandeb. And they, by all accounts, including by some of the Chinese shipping firms that are benefiting from some localized escort, they're still operating there in basically the same fashion that they always have. They're kind of running a regular route. And the expectation is that Chinese shipping is not getting targeted. We know that at some point earlier on in this crisis, starting in December and January, lots of different flagged shipping and owned shipping was signaling on the AIS that they were an all Chinese crew or that they had some connection to China, as though that were some sort of magic amulet against the Houthis. Turns out that either the Houthis' targeting is not very good, their intelligence is not very good, and or their missiles are not very good, because they have sunk Chinese ship bound for Tianjin carrying steel. They have sunk other vessels with a Chinese nexus, and they've certainly harmed Chinese crew, who are among the most well represented among global seafarers. But let me just suggest that the circumstance is different now. China doesn't feel acute threats to its assets, even though it might, given that it's faced some direct attacks. And for now, they're basically idling that force, which is present. It's on station. They do have several surface vessels that could be devoted to the task. Pretty close to what the U.S. has been bringing to bear, which is 4 destroyers. There are usually 3 Chinese surface vessels and an escort task force, but not yet, and I'm not expecting to see it.
Yun, anything you want to add on differences between Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea?
Well, it seems the issue of the piracy has always been focused on the Horn of Africa, not necessarily Red Sea, right? And in this particular case, you were talking about the Houthis, there's no UN Security Council mandate. And the Chinese will always say that, well, our every single naval export mission in the Gulf of Aden was authorized by the Security Council resolution. So there's no legitimate ground for China to even consider joining the U.S.-led coalition in terms of this smooth reaction. So it's not even a question to begin with.
So the next question is, why have we not seen a Chinese-led initiative to address what's happening in the Red Sea? Obviously, China's not joining the U.S. effort. Why is that surprising to you or not?
I don't think that was surprising per se, because, well, I don't think it even occurred to China that it needs to have a China-led effort to address this issue. Like, as Eckhart has already mentioned, the threat is not that high for China to take this level of drastic measures. And the moral calling, I think the Chinese answer to the moral appeal that this is important for the global trade and global commons, the Chinese answer is that, okay, so let's go back to a two-state solutions. So I think the threat perception is different, threat assessment is different, and also the theory of change or the proposed solution is also different.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I view it more as a reflection of what I perceive to be still fairly narrow and discrete interests that China has in the region. And I'll again defer to both of you who have studied some of these bilateral relationships and regional relationships in much greater depth. But I'll offer as a sort of generalizable statement is that this theater of the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, Western Indian Ocean, the kind of whole complex, is quite distant from China's main strategic focus. Its main strategic focus is in East Asia, and it's going to continue to be there, surrounding issues of Taiwan and South China Sea, East China Sea, all those relationships. That is its main point of confrontation with the United States. It's its main expected area of potential strategic conflict. And so I think we will expect to see China not attempt to really bite off more than it can chew in a distant theater where it doesn't feel such acute risks. What we see is, I think, a growing scope and articulation of this idea of China's overseas interests. Again, with both of you have written quite extensively on, but I'll offer just as a simplistic rendering is that's a much narrower way of thinking about China's national interests in the Middle East than is, say, the United States strategic orientation towards the region as a place that needs to be stabilized since at least the 1970s, if not before. Usually people date it to the Suez Crisis in 1956, and subsequent to that, the United States has really kind of been, as a matter of national strategy, committed to maintaining the openness of those sea lines, to maintaining the flows of energy there. And under those conditions, even if we posit that China really needs that and wants that and benefits from it, as long as the United States is still committed to do it, it's not clear why the Chinese are going to lead a parallel effort that would be viewed as threatening or a counter coalition rather than just free ride on whatever it is that is able to be mustered by a coalition to keep the region relatively stable.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. What Isaac just ended on, that to keep the region stable. I think that fundamentally is a reflection of U.S. positioning. that we are the security guarantor of the region, right? And it has been so. The security actor of the region depends on the United States. So when we look at the region, it is from a regional security, regional stability point of view, but that's, I'm afraid, not necessarily the lens that China will view the region. China primarily sees the region as a trading partner, right? It's not defining itself as a security guarantor. So therefore, when there is security crisis in the region, I think the Chinese first calculus is, does that affect my economic interest in the region? And if the trade is not interrupted, and if, well, in the case of oil, the production and the transportation of the oil is not interrupted, the Chinese will see that, hey, our base is covered. And everything goes beyond that. It will require certain creativity and also require certain motive and motivation on China's part to take additional actions to address what we perceive to be a core problem for the regional security. But that view may not be shared by China, or is not shared by China at all. So I think that's a very interesting framing that we're seeing differently from the framing from US and framing from China.
And actually, the next question I have, it directly relates to this from the standpoint of, let's say in a hypothetical world, China did respond with a more forceful military response to the Houthis, attempting in a unilateral way to come in with its military. And there could be questions from a US standpoint about the desirability of that type of unilateral military action. So could you guys unpack a little bit more some of the risks and trade-offs for China if it does become more militarily involved in whether it's the Red Sea or in the Middle East more broadly?
I'll take a quick stab at it. And I guess the risks for China, as well as maybe the risk for the US or for other regional stakeholders, and sort of starting with the latter and then moving to how China would view the risk. It's obviously not, maybe it's not obvious. I will posit it's not necessarily in the United States or US allies and partners' interest to have the People's Liberation Army Navy take a much more significant and active operational role anywhere outside of their jurisdictional waters, because it's all of that would ultimately accrue to their benefit in terms of training and confidence and capability overseas. And if you sort of subscribe to some sort of zero-sum version of this competition, and I'm not endorsing it so much as offering analytically, you wouldn't necessarily want to see them demonstrating it, those capabilities, practicing them, learning in, working interoperably with allied or partner forces, even as has been done with the PLA. These are not necessarily attractive prospects, especially not if we don't think they're going to be especially effective. And I'll leave that aside. From the Chinese perspective, I think there's also significant risk, which is this would obviously throw completely out of whack this entire diplomatic narrative that we've been talking about today, whereby they're basically trying to leverage themselves on the region's seemingly wholehearted support for the Palestinian cause, and basically trying to make it all a discussion about that. We can leave aside whether or not that is actually intrinsically related to what the Houthis are doing, and just suggest that departing from that view and starting to be more active and certainly countering the Houthis would run directly contrary to its a basic global South pro, kind of post-colonial, pro-developing world posture. The fact that that somehow comprises being pro-terrorist group that's attacking civilian targets in the global commons, I think is a liability that and a risk that China runs by not doing something. So they may want to address that. But I think it's certainly not a clear pure play for China one way or the other. But I'm curious what your sense of that is.
Well, first, I don't think China has either the hardware infrastructure or the software infrastructure to project a military intervention role in the current crisis. And we don't have to go into the details as well how much military assets China has and what does that mean. But I would say that, like as I pointed out, China's primary theater is in the West Pacific, and it's about being focused on Taiwan, right? So for China to deviate from that focus and go to Middle East to launch a forceful military response is simply out of sync for China's current national security strategic design. But if it does happen, the potential risks, first, I don't think the countries in the region would necessarily welcome such a interventionist approach from China, because that will vastly complicate the situation. And it also raises a question that we are going to see a bipolarization of the region. And I don't think that's something that the region necessarily wants to see. And secondly, even if the Chinese goes out, I think a key consideration for China is that, are they going to be effective? So if U.S.-led coalition in terms of this military response to the Houthi crisis has not rendered the result that U.S. wanted to see from the beginning, what are the chances of China being successful in achieving that same agenda? What does China's military have that is significantly different from the from this Western alliance that will make China successful? And I would say not much. So if the Chinese do their calculation and realizes that this is a campaign that's unlikely to be won, and they will have to seriously question what is the rationale for an operation like that.
So we're nearing the end of our time. So I want to give both of you a chance to give any final thoughts. You know, one way in which to think about this would be kind of what the current situation in the Red Sea could tell us about the broader context of U.S.-China relations in the Middle East. Or if you want to go a different direction with your final thoughts, you know, what else do you think viewers need to know about this particular situation that's occurring?
I'll just offer briefly before giving you the last word that I think, you know, there's a big discussion about what kind of a great power China, a risen China, is going to be, or even assessing it as it is right now. And I think its relative passivity and quietness in the face of this crisis is a really telling episode, and it's part of this story, however we look at it. And it's very much deferring to the United States to be the regional security guarantor, and focusing its own security as well as economic interests in a much narrower sense. And I don't think this is without risk. I'm thinking about some of the relationships that China is now potentially compromising by being relatively passive in the face of some major threats to, for example, Egypt's economy, which, if we're thinking about who's really the most badly harmed by this, it's actually not China, it's Egypt. China's more generally harmed as the biggest trading country, and that depends on these flows, but acutely it's Egypt. And I think China is showing itself to be not very effective and not very reliable as a patron, as a great power player in the region, is probably the sort of storyline that I think is most interesting in regards to the U.S.-China relationship.
Great points, and I have I think I'll make 3 points on this particular issue. The first one is, if you look at how the Chinese national security narrative has evolved in the past 10 years, one of the key issue is the issue of international discourse, that basically who controls the narrative, right? So I think in this case, the Chinese response would be, what kind of great power we will be does not depend on the definition of the West. It depends on what we feel comfortable with. It depends on how we perceive us to be the great power, and what kind of role, what constructive role that we will bring to the table. So I think in this case, we're looking very clearly that the Chinese are projecting its own agenda, following its own national interest. And then we'll even argue that, hey, we're playing the role of a great power according to our own definition. So thank you very much. We don't need Western imposition of what we should be. We are what we are. That's the first point. And the second point, I think the Chinese calculus on this is that it's all relative, right? And when China looks at the role where its leadership or great power role in the region, it's all relative or in reference or in comparison to what U.S. is, right? And I think in this case, the Chinese would make the argument that U.S. as a security guarantor is both the guarantor of the security, but also the disruptor of the security. Because then, of course, it goes back to the same argument that Houthis are making trouble because of the Israel-Hamas war, and therefore, who has been supporting the two-state solution and who has not? So in that particular issue, on the thorny issue of the role of Israel in regional peace and stability, I think the Chinese will argue that, well, maybe what U.S. represents is not a path forward. It has not created peace. And that leads to my my third point, which is, I don't think China's goal is to replace the United States in the region at all. Like we have discussed, China doesn't have the military resources. It does not necessarily have the motivation to replace US as a security guarantor. So in the anxiety of the great power competition, when we talk about China coming to the Middle East and trying to replace the United States, I don't think that's accurate. What China is actually trying to do is to displace a US dominant role in the region, but not necessarily with the dominance by the Chinese. So instead, if you look at the Chinese calling for international conferences on Israel-Palestine issue and calling for the Gulf countries to come up with their own multilateral security architecture to deal with the conflict between Iran and the rest of the Gulf, I think that's the Chinese answer. It's a regional multilateral approach to regional security. Whether it's going to be successful, we don't know. And you could even argue that it is kind of irresponsible for China to propose a solution that may or may not work. While we know that the current U.S. security role or security guarantor role in the region has been acknowledged by most countries in the region, one could make the argument that the Chinese proposal is not necessarily a responsible approach to the future of the region's peace and stability. But hey, that is a Chinese proposal.
So I want to thank both of you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I think what's happening in the Red Sea, what's been happening since October 7th, it's really important for us to look at these in an analytical, thoughtful way to start to really understand China's approach. And I do think it's illustrative and really appreciate both of you speaking with us. I would also like to thank the National Committee's staff members behind the scenes who've made today's interview possible. We hope that those who've tuned in today found the interview both interesting and informative, and that you will join us for future National Committee programming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.